Now, looking back, maybe the tipping point, the point of no return, was Jade Helm. This all started about 18 months ago when the U.S. military announced an 8-week training exercise in several states in the American Southwest. The idea was for Green Berets and Navy SEALs and other special operations troops to train in different kinds of terrain that they might find themselves in overseas. Now, that was the official stated purpose of Jade Helm. But on conspiracy theorist websites and on the far-right fringe, Jade Helm was the first stage of a martial law takeover of Texas and maybe other states. On the fringe right, Jade Helm was actually the military setting up prison camps for American citizens and also something to do with aliens hiding underground. Jade Helm was all about a network of underground tunnels where the entrances were disguised by mysteriously closed down Walmarts. The tunnels went into secret, deep underground military bases, DUMs for short, DUMs. That's helpful. Now, if you line the maps up right, you can see with your wide-opened eyes the network of underground Walmart tunnels, and that would be where the Chinese troops would set up their headquarters, or maybe the Walmarts are where they'd stash all the Texas Patriots guns after the Jade Helm troops take them away. Whatever it was, folks, it was all in the maps.
There are maps circulating that show several deep underground bases around the United States. There are also maps circulating that show tunnels that connect those bases. You will also see how Walmarts connect to some of the bases and some of the tunnels.
In the document, Texas, Utah, and conservative areas of Southern California are listed as hostile areas.
I hope Jade Helm 15 is not the preparation for or the actual implementation of a roundup of patriotic men who have the capacity to influence and inspire the citizenry to resist a coup against the Republic.
We hope so, too. Now, that was the Jade Helm conspiracy theory, just basically a nutty theory, and it could have ended there. A few people out on the fringe uploading the videos or calling into radio shows. But it spread. It grew. And here's why it may be a tipping point. It went from the fringe to mainstream conservative and fast. The Republican governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, actually ordered the state guard to monitor the Jade Helm exercise so that, quote, Texans know their safety, constitutional rights, private property rights, and civil liberties will not be infringed. To be clear now, he called out his state guard to monitor the U.S. military exercises. He wasn't alone. Texas Senator Ted Cruz said he wrote to the Pentagon to demand answers about Jade Helm. Senator Rand Paul, of course, the presidential contender at the time, said he was looking into the issue. Suddenly, along with legitimate policy issues like guns or abortion, this fantasy conspiracy of a military takeover of Texas became some sort of sleeper litmus test in Republican politics. Pretty soon, how seriously you took the threat of this secret federal takeover of Texas was a litmus test for the GOP presidential primary. That is just nuts. Now, President Obama has cited this very case study, which you may or may not remember, as exactly what was wrong with the modern GOP.
We did a military exercise. Pentagon does these periodically in Texas, and suddenly all the folks in Texas were all like, they're going to take over right now. I'm serious. And then the senator down there said, yeah, we better look into that. And the governor says, well, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? What does that mean? Really? You think that, like, the entire Pentagon said, oh, really? You want to declare martial law and take over Texas? Let's do it under the guise of routine training missions. And everybody's going to be, but they took it seriously. This is in the swamp of crazy that has been fed over and over and over and over again.
Now, it may not have been totally obvious at the time, but Jade Helm was a kind of an early warning about how fake news can be mainstreamed, especially when the misinformation is powered through fact-free partisan politics, and especially when fringe believers just want to hear candidates say they'll look into some theory. It's a rhetorical specialty of the candidate who took conspiracy theories to another level this year, Donald Trump. And he was perhaps eclipsed only by Ben Carson for peddling things that he should have known better than to peddle. Dr. Ben Carson was definitely not using the scientific method when he offered up theories like this.
You know, Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority and Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, were both classmates in the class of 1968 at Patrice Lumumba University in Moscow, where they became acquainted with a young Vladimir Putin. So these are deep ties.
Deep. Well, those three people actually were not classmates in Moscow or anywhere. For starters, Putin's a good decade and a half younger than the other two. Ben Carson later said he learned about the ties between those leaders from advisors across the government that he wouldn't name, including the CIA, and he added, "There's a lot more information I've gotten that's probably not appropriate for revelation." Or there was the time Carson asserted the Chinese had deployed troops in Syria.
We also must recognize that it's a very complex place. You know, the Chinese are there as well as the Russians, and you have all kinds of factions there.
Now, that could have been a simple misstatement. We all make them. But what's important is that rather than deal with that kind of defense, Carson aides just doubled down. They said their own special intelligence determined China had deployed in Syria, which it had not. Ben Carson was getting a lot of weird and accurate information from a lot of mysterious places during the campaign, and we've not even mentioned the story he likes to tell about how there was a Star of David on the back of the $1 bill. Spoiler, there isn't one. Or his theory that the pyramids in Egypt were not built by the Egyptians and were actually used as grain silos, no matter how many archaeologists protested. And Dr. Ben Carson today, as you may have heard, is officially Donald Trump's nominee for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, which is strange on a few levels. The fact that Carson, though he is a remarkable surgeon, has no qualifications for a federal housing agency. The fact that during the campaign, Trump called him a pathological person and compared him to a, quote, child molester at one point. And the fact that Carson, according to his closest advisor just today, still doesn't feel qualified for the job or want it.
A few weeks ago, you were quoted in media reports saying Ben Carson wasn't interested in a cabinet job. And I'm quoting now, Dr. Carson feels he has, quote, no government experience. He's never run a federal agency. The last thing he'd want to do was take a position that could cripple the presidency. Is that no longer the case?
That was not accurate, by the way. Dr. Carson's position was that he preferred that if Mr. Trump could find someone that could fit the role of what he wanted, he would have preferred to stay in private industry. But that's not what Mr. Trump wanted. He wanted Dr. Carson as his cabinet, and he's glad to serve.
That was this morning. This nomination is just weird, even before you consider all the ways in which Ben Carson seems to have a kind of disconnect with reality. If Dr. Carson is confirmed, he won't be the only conspiracy theorist in Trump's inner circle. Take General Michael Flynn, who is Trump's national security advisor. He's been a frequent distributor of conspiracy theories online, including on Twitter, and fake news stories slamming Hillary Clinton, including the false and slanderous allegations she was involved in some kind of child sex trafficking. General Flynn's son, who also is his chief of staff and we know has a government transition team email account already, has been pushing a Hillary Clinton child sex ring conspiracy theory that also involves a pizza restaurant in Washington, D.C., and he continued to push that conspiracy theory, as you may have seen over the past day, even after a gunman entered that very restaurant and fired at least one shot. The gunman reportedly telling police he was there to self-investigate one of those conspiracy theories. And we want to be clear tonight, we don't know enough yet about the mental state of that man or what motivated him or even whether him or his actions fit into any political affiliation. We're reporting on this because it is so much bigger than that individual gunman. The fact is that Trump's national security advisory and his chief of staff are peddlers of these kind of outlandish conspiracy theories with all kinds of real consequences. And when the transition team says Trump was well briefed on, say, his call with the president of Taiwan, they might be taking a page out of Ben Carson's campaign defense that his private briefings trumped the actual facts and intelligence. Because while Trump reportedly skips most intel briefings offered by the actual CIA, this is one of the people who is briefing him. There's a lot of concern about fake news right now in the body politic. Well, we can add fake intelligence to that list as well, as it appears to be working its way right up through the new president's cabinet. Joining us now for historical context is Michael Beschloss, NBC's presidential historian. Great to have you here tonight.
Good to see you, Ari.
How new is this in our politics and government, and what do Trump's picks say to you about how much we have to worry about this?
Well, I think we're seeing this growing in recent years. You know, you well remember 2004, where a lot of people who voted for George W. Bush thought that Saddam Hussein had a lot to do with 9/11, or that there was something grossly wrong with John Kerry's war record, which was heroic, in Vietnam. And now we have an outgoing president who many people have been led to believe is a secret Muslim or was born in Kenya. Still, a lot of people believe that these things did not all happen by accident.
Have other outsiders who've come to Washington, and we know that has been popular throughout history in both parties, relied as much on picking some outsider candidates? It's hard to come up with any example of someone like Carson who has so publicly suggested that he neither wants nor is capable of doing this post.
Yeah, I guess he gets at least 1 point for honesty and candor. But beyond that, you know, usually we're watching a huge experiment. We've never seen a president like Donald Trump come in with, as we've said before, no military experience, no public service experience. He wears that as a badge of honor, but you would think that he'd be trying to sort of calm people who are worried about the fact that there's certain things he doesn't know and hasn't done. John Kennedy had been in Congress for 14 years, yet he felt that because he was only 43 years old, the youngest elected, he'd better appoint some pretty senior people to foreign policy positions, which he did. George W. Bush came in after being governor of Texas, no foreign policy experience. He immediately appointed Colin Powell as Secretary of State. I'm surprised that Donald Trump doesn't say, a lot of people who voted against me, even some who voted for me, are unsettled by the fact that there are certain things I haven't done before. Maybe I can calm them down by appointing people who've had a lot of time in this kind of work.
What do you think about the idea that one of the traditional knocks against the press was to try to influence what the incumbent or traditional press would do? And certainly that's a feature of modern campaigns for a long time. What about the shift here that perhaps when you look at people like Steve Bannon in the White House, who worked to push Breitbart.com out, and the reliance on these stories, including what we just showed, the circulating of them, the idea that there's an effort to supplant the entire press, not to affect what it does, but to replace it with your own web droppings?
Oh, you have seen Republicans in recent days saying we don't need the press anymore. And that's something that's different from almost the whole of American history, because that's only been possible during the time of the internet, which is what, 15, 20 years? So we as Americans who want to preserve our democracy, we'd better to think about new ways to make sure that in this age in which fake news can be disseminated in a very big way on the internet, that people who read this will know how to disseminate, how to separate wheat from chaff.
Right. I mean, this seems to be where it's going, especially when you have a president-elect who's so proud of his own communication abilities, which obviously served him well, at least partly politically. NBC presidential historian Michael Beschloss, thanks for being here tonight.
My pleasure, Ari.
Appreciate it.